until it's decided that it's given you long enough, and it then just, for some reason, stops. I'm not comfortable with touch screens. I find myself sometimes having to, I don't know, where did I touch? What the hell happened then? How did I know? So, never mind my problems with new technology. Thank you for agreeing to this interview. Should we first ask you to say who you are?
Sure.
So I'm April Conolly. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Father Bill's in MainSpring.
And Chief Operating Officer means you cover clinical services.
So I run the day-to-day programming at the organization, overseeing all of the staff who work with the participants.
And at a rough guess, roughly how many staff and how many units of housing?
It's about 400 units of housing, and staff across the agency, it's about 180 staff.
So that gives us a measure of the size of the outfit and the size of the job. And John.
Yep, John Yaswinski, CEO and President of Father Bill's in MainSpring. We have about a $20 million operating budget. As long as we, with the housing that we have, we also shelter about 133 families a night. We also shelter about 265 individuals scattered throughout the South Shore region of Massachusetts, south of Boston. And we also have workforce programs and prevention programs. So we definitely started off our roots of sheltering in the early 80s, but have moved into more of trying to provide solution-oriented approaches to combating homelessness.
And it's the breadth of involvement in all of those different areas that, to my mind, was particularly interesting about Father Bill and MainSpring, and probably the reason why they suggested I come here.
Yeah.
Because you see people right through a whole range of different changes and transitions and conditions and so on. And it's we've been to visit a couple of places, and it's the ability to be really flexible and really personalised with those services that really comes over to me. So, John, you were going to talk about how this shelter movement has changed since the 80s and what fed it and where it's going now.
Yeah, I view it as, in the early 80s, people like Father Bill McCarthy here in Quincey and some of our other founders in Brockton, and people, no matter where we were in the Commonwealth, or, people were coming to churches and coming to different civic groups, Salvation Armies, and saying, instead of just saying I need help with the food or the rent or some clothing, is I don't have a place to stay tonight. And that was a real shift in people's requests, and people started to see people sleeping in the doorways of the churches and the stairwells and at city halls and parks, of course. And so, one of the things that our founders always felt was we were going to be, by providing an emergency shelter response, a safe place to stay in the church basements or in the Salvation Army, is we felt like it was going to be a very temporary response. Both in the sense of somebody being able to stay with us just for a few nights, and then getting back on their feet, and knowing that our mission, that our coalition, that our response was going to be very temporary and years needed, and that then we would get help from public and private support there. And sad to say, we're still here, we're still needed, and we've seen more and more people coming to our doors. And I think for Father Bill's in MainSpring, we in 1999, the chairperson of our board and myself interviewed every guest that came into the shelter that one night at Father Bill's place, about 140 people. And we asked them one question, and we said, how can Father Bill's help you? Because up to that point, since 82, we had just been providing the bed, the meal, the clothing, the food. And they said, and like 85% of the responses, we wrote all the responses on little sticky Post-its, and brought it to a board retreat, and it was, I need housing, I need a home, was the overarching theme. And that just sent us shockwaves to our mission to say, what are we doing? It's great that we have this interfaith coalition, that we're here giving everybody a bed and a meal, but the customer, the people we want to help, our neighbors, are asking for housing. We should start advocating for it, and we need to start doing it if other people won't. And that's kind of where we're at today.
And that's a big leap, because some people would say our job is to advocate and do what we do, and other people's job is to do the rest. But FBMS, Father Bill and MainSpring. I'm learning to use this as an acronym. You were much more proactive. You were much more, there's a gap, we're going to fill it.
Yeah, I think for us, we went around and we asked around to what you think of more of the affordable housing developers, some of the community development companies, and said, we're not housing developers. Would you help us, develop the housing?
So
and
partnerships.
Partnerships. And we found one tremendous partnership here in Quincey, NeighborWorks of Southern Mass, and they've helped us partner and create about 100 units of the 400 that we have, which is a great partnership. But at the end of the day, we realized that there is about 30% of the population that we see that maybe we need to develop that housing for. It needs to be low threshold, harm reduction, as barrier free as we can get to, and everybody comfortable with. And that's been our role. So we're not trying to develop the housing for 100% of the people that come into our buildings or need us or are on the streets. It's for that core group that that the shelter will become permanent residence for.
Yeah. Well, when you say the shelter, you don't mean the shelter will be permanent residence for. You mean
without the housing, the emergency shelter would.
It would be
they
permanent
would otherwise
if
stay
it
in the
weren't.
shelter
So you might as well do it.
permanently.
If it's going to be permanent housing, you might as well do it right and do it with the support.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And one of the things that was most striking about places we've been and the conversations we've had in the car is that you have really an interesting mixture, and you can move to and fro between scattered site or dispersed housing and congregated housing. Roughly how much of each do you have?
So for more of a congregate style housing is probably
100 right now. Gotta be.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's actually I think a little bit more than probably closer to 120 to 140 if we count kind of our Brockton sites as that as well.
That's 120 to 140 individuals living in those units.
Right.
And they are 10, 12, 15 or so the kind of size of.
Yeah, typically, our largest project that we would consider congregate style living is probably 31 units, and even then that's not really shared facilities. And then, the highest we go is probably 15 to 18 in a congregate.
And one at least that we saw is two houses next door to each other, and each of them, and even the two different floors in each house are little micro communities. So even within a larger unit, you've got smaller sub communities and people who befriend each other and so on.
I think one of the things why it's great to have a little bit of a portfolio of opportunity to offer somebody is if somebody that's been chronically homeless for a long time goes and struggles and isolates maybe in a scattered site their own apartment, and in times in the past maybe they would be like, you lost the housing, you start back at the shelter level, where if you have a little bit, or you say, well, maybe they do better in a congregate where there's more other people, socialization and those things. And I think offering that and having that within your portfolio when you're looking to house our most vulnerable chronic group is a good approach.
Yeah, and we've seen the reverse more often in the past few years, that we place someone who we assume to be very high need and need a lot of supports into a congregate style building where they're living kind of right next door and sharing a bathroom with 3 other people, and found it to be incredibly disruptive to both them and their neighbors, and then needing to say, okay, well, as we get to know them, they really need something with a little bit more isolation. They need to be sort of a little bit more independent. They might need a lot of support, but they really can't live in close quarters with people. And that's never easy to tell when someone's coming out of an institutional environment like a shelter. You don't really know. A shelter has 24-hour staffing. People are being redirected constantly. So when you put them into a housing environment, whether it's staffed or not, people have the ability to self-direct. And when they're living communally, it's very different.
And being in your own place, let alone with or without other people, is going to bring things out of you that you really couldn't have spotted and predicted.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that something you really can't spot at all, or are you trying to do any work to identify whether there are particular characteristics, age, length of time on the street, clinical histories and so on?
Yeah, we try to rely on our clinical partners for that. So our staff typically are not clinically trained, and I think the more we're working with a more and more vulnerable population and people who have a lot more complex mental health needs, we're seeing the need to have that kind of expertise on our team to really begin to kind of identify
within
those
the team,
trends.
not just
Because we have found it, we've seen the population sort of evolve and become much more complex, and our staff are sort of just trying to piece it together. You talked about trauma-informed care, and we've tried to provide trainings around motivational interviewing and trauma-informed care for our staff. And I think sort of organically people have a sensibility about those things, that people have experienced trauma and we have to approach them a certain way in order to not, create more stress on them. But there's very much always been a recognition with our capacity that we aren't clinically focused, and so we need to rely on people who have that kind of training. I think Father Bill's and MainSpring, you mentioned, have a history of tending to say, well, we're going to fill the gap where there's a gap, and
there's a gap, we'll fill it.
I've sort of asked that question of, are we going to end up needing to fill that gap, as we're not necessarily able to learn those things as easily.
You have the bodies.
Right.
You're the ones that are going to get pulled into some kind of filling it, but is there a point at which you should say, we're not going to fill every gap? Some of the stuff I've read on trauma-informed care makes a distinction, I think, really useful between trauma-specific services or treatment, effectively, and trauma-informed care, which is what influences you in the way you respond. And so trauma-specific services, I think they call them TSS, trauma-specific services. You probably do need to have a specialist trained clinician to operate that. But trauma-informed care is about how we relate to each other. And how could that... And trauma-informed care does seem to actually strike a chord. People instantly can go, I've seen some slides of trainings that look like they would take about 3 or 4 hours to get through. Whereas to me, just the word trauma-informed care changes the way you see the work you're doing.
I think what I've seen a lot too is when we move people that have been on the streets and coming in, as you said, when they get into that housing, they start dealing with a lot of other things. And I think for us as an organization is to know what supports do they need as things are starting to bubble up that maybe they haven't really thought about or dealt with in time. And I think that's one of the things that when I think of kind of what our role should be, is to provide that community-based case management, but really it's about just being there and saying, what do you need to stay housed? And let's go find the resources for it and leverage those resources, and not think that everything is going to be provided by our organization, but we're like a broker of service almost.
Okay, we've reached what could be a good point to pause, because I know you said you've got some questions you wanted to ask me.
Yeah.
So, should we do?
Yeah.
I could probably turn this off at this point, because otherwise, if it's going to be me answering, there's going to be a long time. When all I've got is you going, oh, that's very good. So let's